Before the first bird sang and long before the sun peeked over the edge of the hills, he was already awake. Not because an alarm buzzed or a phone rang, but because his body knew. It had learned over years of repetition that this was the time to rise. The air inside the small one-room house was still cool, carrying the faint scent of yesterday's lentils and the earthy smell of mud walls. He lay on a thin mattress spread over the floor, listening to the soft breathing of his wife and 2 children beside him. For a moment, he let himself linger in that quiet, the only peace he'd get all day. Then slowly, he sat up. His back groaned in protest, a dull ache that never really went away. He rubbed his eyes, careful not to make noise, and reached for the same faded shirt he'd worn for the past 3 days. It was torn near the elbow, but he'd stitched it himself with uneven thread. Every stitch was a small act of pride. He wouldn't ask for new clothes when there were bigger needs. Outside, the world was just beginning to stir. A rooster crowed in the distance. A neighbor's dog barked. He filled a small steel bowl with water from the clay pot in the corner, splashed his face and ran his fingers through his thinning hair. No mirror. He didn't need one. He knew what he looked like. Sun-darkened skin, deep lines around his eyes, hands rough like tree bark. But he also knew what mattered more, what his children saw when they looked at him. Not weakness, not shame, just a man who showed up. He stepped out barefoot onto the packed dirt path. The ground was cool under his feet, a small comfort before the day's heat arrived. He walked the same route he'd taken for over 20 years, past the banyan tree with the broken swing, past the little shop that sold tea and biscuits, past the school where his daughter would soon be walking with books tucked under her arm. He never went inside that school. He didn't belong there, not in his work clothes, not with dust already clinging to his shoes. But he always slowed down when he passed it, just to listen, to the sound of children reciting lessons, to the laughter between classes. That sound was his fuel. The construction site was on the edge of the growing city, where new buildings rose like giants from what used to be fields. Trucks rumbled in before sunrise, dumping loads of sand, cement, and bricks. By the time he arrived, the foreman was already shouting orders, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp. He didn't say good morning. No one did. Here, greetings were earned through sweat, not words. He picked up his spot near the pile of red bricks. Each one weighed about 5 pounds. Nothing too heavy, until you carried 100 of them, then 200, then more. He stacked them onto a metal tray balanced on his head, steadied himself, and walked. Step by step, across uneven ground, up narrow wooden planks, into the skeleton of a half-built apartment complex. The sun climbed higher, burning through his thin shirt. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stung a little, but he blinked it away. Stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant fewer rupees at the end of the week. He didn't count the bricks. He didn't count the steps. He just moved. His mind, though, was never empty. While his body worked, his thoughts wandered. To his daughter's exam results, to the leak in the roof that needed patching before monsoon, to the price of rice at the market. And always, to the small tin box hidden under a loose floor tile at home. Inside it, folded carefully between old newspaper, were rupee notes, some crisp, most worn soft from being handled too often. Every note had a story. This one came from skipping lunch. That one from walking 10 extra kilometers instead of taking the bus. Another from selling the old radio that still worked but wasn't needed. He'd never told anyone about the box, not even his wife. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't want her to worry or feel guilty. She already did, enough, cooking over a smoky stove, washing clothes by hand at the well, mending school uniforms until the fabric gave out. They were a team, even in silence. At midday, the sun was brutal. The foreman called a short break. Workers huddled in the scant shade of a half-built wall, pulling out cloth-wrapped bundles of food. He opened his own. A few rotis, a smear of pickle, a boiled potato. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing this was all he'd have until evening. Nearby, two younger men laughed, sharing stories about a movie they'd seen. He smiled faintly, but didn't join in. He wasn't unfriendly, just tired, and maybe a little out of place. Most of the other workers were decades younger. Some didn't even know his name. To them, he was just the old brick man. But to his daughter, he was everything. He remembered the night she'd come home with her science project, a model of the solar system made from clay and painted with care. She'd stayed up past midnight, her small fingers shaping planets, labeling each one in neat handwriting. When she showed it to him, her eyes shone with hope. "Do you think it's good enough, Papa?" she'd asked. He hadn't known much about planets, but he knew pride when he saw it. He'd nodded, throat tight, and said, "It's perfect." And in that moment, carrying bricks felt lighter. Now, as the afternoon wore on and the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, he thought of her again. She was studying for her final exams, the ones that could get her into college. He didn't understand half the words in her textbooks, but he understood effort. He saw how she stayed up late with a kerosene lamp when the power went out, how she reused paper until every inch was covered in notes. She never complained about their life. Not once. That hurt him more than the blisters on his palms. The whistle blew for the end of the shift. His legs trembled as he walked back to the gate, shoulders slumped, shirt soaked through. The foreman handed him his day's wages. Just enough to buy food, maybe a little extra if prices were kind. He counted it quickly, then tucked it into his waistband, safe from pickpockets. The walk home was longer now, every muscle protesting. But as he turned onto his street and saw the smoke curling from his chimney, something warm stirred in his chest. Home wasn't much. A single room with a thatched roof, a small courtyard where his wife grew a few herbs, a rusted bucket for bathing. But it was theirs. And inside, someone was waiting. His daughter would be at the door before he even reached it, book in hand, ready to tell him about her day. His son would run out shouting "Papa," like it was the best word in the world. And his wife would have saved him the best piece of roti, hidden under the cloth so it wouldn't get cold. He wasn't rich. He owned no car, no phone, no fancy shoes. But as he stepped through the doorway, greeted by three faces that lit up just because he was there, he knew something the black cars driving past on the highway never would. Real wealth isn't measured in what you carry in your pockets, but in what you carry in your heart. And for now, that was enough. Every evening after the dust had settled and the last call for dinner had echoed through the narrow lanes, he waited. Not for anything grand, just for the house to fall quiet. His wife would be washing the plates by the well, humming an old folk tune under her breath. His son would be asleep on the floor mat, one arm flung over his eyes, worn out from playing cricket with a rubber ball and a broken bat. And his daughter, she'd still be at the small wooden stool near the window, bent over her books, pencil moving fast across the page, chasing dreams written in ink. That's when he'd slip away. Not far, just to the corner of the room where the floor tile was slightly loose. He'd kneel, careful not to make noise, and lift it with fingers that still ached from the day's labor. Beneath it sat a small, rusted tin box, the kind that once held biscuits, now repurposed into something far more precious. He'd open it slowly, as if handling something sacred, and add the day's savings. Sometimes it was just 10 rupees. Other days, if he'd skipped lunch or walked instead of taking the shared rickshaw, maybe 20. Every note was folded neatly, smoothed flat, placed with care beside the others. He never counted the total, not out loud, not even in his head, because if he did, he might start doubting. He might think, is this enough? Will it ever be enough? And doubt was dangerous. Doubt made you hesitate. Hesitation made you stop. And stopping wasn't an option. Not when your child's future was on the line. His daughter didn't know about the box. She knew they were poor. That was obvious. She wore hand-me-down uniforms, carried a school bag patched with tape, and sometimes went without new notebooks because the old ones had to be reused until the paper turned gray. But she never complained. In fact, she seemed to carry their situation with a quiet grace that amazed him. She'd come home from school, eyes bright, and say things like, Papa, today our teacher said I have a good mind for science. Or, I helped Ravi understand fractions. He couldn't do them before. Those words were worth more than any coin. But lately he'd noticed something new in her eyes, a flicker of worry. Not about herself, but about him. She'd watch him rub his lower back when he thought no one was looking. She'd offer to carry his worn-out lunchbox to the site, even though it was heavy and the path was rough. Once she'd quietly placed a small jar of homemade ointment beside his sleeping mat. "It's for your hands," she'd whispered before slipping away. He'd opened it that night and smelled the sharp, healing scent of turmeric and neem. He didn't use it, not because it wouldn't help, but because using it felt like admitting he was breaking down, and he couldn't afford to break. Not yet. What he didn't know was that his daughter had her own secret. While he saved rupees under the floor, she saved time. Every minute she could steal from sleep, from play, from rest, she gave to her books. When the electricity went out, which was often, she'd light a kerosene lamp and study by its yellow glow, shielding the flame with her hand so the smoke wouldn't stain her pages. When her friends invited her to festivals or birthday parties, she'd smile and say, "Maybe next time," then return to her equations and essays. She didn't resent it. She saw it as her part of the bargain. If her father carried bricks, she would carry books, and together they'd build something better. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to him. It came to the school, sealed in an official-looking envelope with a crest and bold lettering. The headmaster called her into his office, his voice unusually soft. "You've done something remarkable," he said, handing it to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was an invitation. Her essay, written during a rainy afternoon when the roof leaked and she'd moved her books under the driest corner, had been chosen. Out of thousands of entries across the state, hers stood out. The topic had been simple: what dignity means to me. She'd written about her father. Not in a sad way, not begging for pity, but with quiet admiration. She described how he never cursed the heat, never argued with the foreman, never let shame touch his shoulders even when others looked away. "My father carries bricks," she'd written, "but he carries them like they're gifts. That's dignity." Now, because of those words, she'd been selected for a National Youth Award, and with it came something even more precious: a full scholarship to one of the country's top universities. Tuition covered, books provided, even a small living stipend. She ran all the way home, the letter clutched to her chest like a heartbeat. When she burst through the door, breathless and beaming, he was mending a tear in his work trousers with a needle too big for the job. He looked up, startled by her energy. "Papa," she gasped, holding out the paper. "Look." He took it slowly, his rough fingers almost too big for the delicate paper. He couldn't read all the words. The formal language was beyond him, but he recognized the university's name. He'd seen its tall gates while hauling bricks near the campus years ago. Back then he'd stood outside for just a moment, imagining what it must be like inside. Now his daughter was being invited in. His eyes filled, but he blinked fast. He didn't want her to see him cry. Instead, he pulled her into a hug, brief, strong, full of everything he couldn't say. "You did this," he murmured into her hair. "All you." But later, when she'd gone to show the letter to her mother, he sat alone in the dim light and read it again, tracing each word with his fingertip. His heart swelled with pride, but underneath a quiet fear stirred. The letter said the scholarship covered tuition. But not everything. There would be uniforms, travel, exam fees, maybe a hostel deposit. Small things, maybe. But to them, mountains. That night, after everyone slept, he went to the tin box again. He lifted the notes, counted them slowly this time, not with doubt, but with purpose. It wasn't much. Not nearly enough. But it was a start. The next morning, he did something he hadn't done in years. He bought a small notebook from the corner shop. On the first page, he wrote in careful, uneven letters, "For college." And under it, he wrote the amount in the box. Every evening after that, he added to it, sometimes just 5 rupees, sometimes more. He started taking extra shifts on Sundays, even though his body screamed in protest. He sold the old blanket he used at the site, the one his wife had stitched for him years ago. He even gave up tea at the roadside stall, a small luxury he'd allowed himself for 20 years. Each sacrifice was silent. Each one was love. Meanwhile, his daughter threw herself into preparing for the next stage: interviews, presentations, a final exam to confirm her place. She practiced speaking in front of the cracked mirror, voice steady, eyes clear. She borrowed books from the school library, copied notes by hand when she couldn't keep them overnight. And every night before sleep took her, she'd whisper a promise to herself, "I will make this count." He watched her from the shadows,
Heart full, worry hidden one evening.
as they sat together peeling potatoes for dinner. She looked at him and said softly, "Papa, no matter what happens, I'll find a way. Even if I have to clean classrooms or tutor younger kids, I'll make it work." He nodded, but inside, he made a silent vow of his own. "You won't have to, because if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was carry weight. And if that weight now included her dreams, he'd carry it with his last breath." The tin box grew heavier, note by note. Not with money alone, but with hope. And in their small house where the walls were thin and the roof leaked, something unbreakable was being built, brick by brick, rupee by rupee, word by word. The days after the scholarship letter arrived moved like slow river water, steady, quiet, but carrying something powerful beneath the surface. At first, there was celebration. His wife cooked a special meal with extra ghee, even though it cost more than usual. His son drew a picture of his sister wearing a graduation cap, proudly taping it to the wall. And his daughter, she walked taller, spoke clearer, as if the weight of uncertainty had finally lifted from her shoulders. But soon the real work began. Forms needed filling. Documents needed copying. Birth certificates, school records, proof of income, all of it had to be gathered, stamped, and submitted before the deadline. He took half days from the site, something he rarely did, just to stand in long lines at government offices where fans whirred overhead but offered little relief. He filled out forms with careful handwriting, double-checking each box, asking younger men nearby to explain words he didn't understand. No one mocked him. Most just nodded and helped quietly, recognizing the look in his eyes, the look of a parent fighting for his child's future. Back home, his daughter practiced for the final interview that would confirm her place in the program. She stood in front of the small mirror propped on a shelf, speaking aloud. "My name is... and I believe education is not just about books, but about becoming someone who can lift others up." Her voice wavered at first, then grew stronger with each try. He'd sit nearby pretending to mend a torn strap on his work bag, but really just listening. Every time she said, "lift others up," his chest tightened. She didn't know it, but she was already doing that, just by being who she was. Then came the day the second letter arrived. It wasn't from the university this time. The envelope was thicker, heavier, with a glossy finish and a logo embossed in gold, a foundation he'd never heard of, but one that sounded important. His hand shook a little as he handed it to his daughter. She tore it open with more caution than excitement, eyes scanning the page quickly. And then she froze. Her breath caught. Her fingers gripped the paper like it might fly away. Slowly, she looked up at him, eyes wide, lips parted. "Papa," she whispered. This is real?" He nodded, though he didn't know what it said. She read it aloud, voice trembling. "Congratulations. Your essay, Dignity in Labor, has been selected as the National Youth Leadership Award winner. In addition to the full academic grant, you will receive mentorship from Mr. Rajiv Kapoor, founder of the Horizon Foundation, and a one-time support fund for educational essentials." She looked at him, tears welling. "It covers everything, Papa, books, hostel, travel, even a laptop." He didn't understand what a laptop was, but he understood everything. That word washed over him like cool rain after a long drought. He reached out and touched the letter gently, as if it were made of glass. Then, without a word, he stood up, walked outside, and sat on the low stone wall at the edge of their yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. He stared at his hands, cracked, stained, permanently bent from years of gripping bricks. These hands had built other people's homes, other people's futures, and now somehow they had helped build his daughter's. He didn't cry. But his shoulders shook just once, a silent release of all the fear he'd carried for months. Inside, his wife hugged their daughter tightly, whispering prayers of thanks. His son danced around the room, shouting, "Didi's going to college! Didi's going to college!" The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, a few neighbors stopped by, not to gawk, but to offer blessings, a handful of sweets, a borrowed pen for more forms. In a place where good news was rare, this felt like a shared victory. But the real surprise came a few days later. His daughter received a call, not on their landline, they didn't have one, but at the small shop down the road where the owner let her use his phone. She returned home pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "Papa," she said, voice hushed. "Mr. Kapoor. He read my essay, he said." He cried, he blinked. A man so rich he probably owned buildings taller than the ones he helped construct. Crying over words written by his daughter in a leaky room with a kerosene lamp. "He wants to meet me," she continued. "Not just at the award ceremony. He said he'd like to come here. To our home." He stared at her. "Here?" She nodded. "He said he wants to meet the man I wrote about." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he looked around at the cracked walls, the patched roof, the single bulb hanging from a frayed wire. Shame flickered in his chest, hot and sudden. What would a man like that think of this place? Of him, but his daughter saw it. She knelt in front of him, took his rough hands in hers, and said, "Papa, you're the reason I wrote it. You're the dignity. Don't hide." He swallowed hard, nodded. The next week, they cleaned the house as if preparing for a festival. His wife scrubbed the floor until her knuckles were raw. His son swept the courtyard again and again, chasing away every leaf and pebble. His daughter washed the curtains, thin cotton sheets really, and hung them to dry in the sun. They didn't have fancy things to display, so they displayed care, cleanliness, respect. The day before the visit, he did something unusual. He went to the market and bought a new shirt. Not expensive, just plain white cotton, the kind worn by office clerks and teachers. It felt strange against his skin, too soft, too clean. He tried it on that night, standing in front of the mirror his daughter used. He straightened the collar, smoothed the front. For the first time in years, he saw not just a laborer, but a father, a man worthy of being seen. The morning of the visit, he didn't go to the construction site. Instead, he sat on the porch, hands folded, heart pounding like a drum. He watched the road waiting, and then, in the distance, dust rising, engine humming, he saw them. 2 black cars, long, sleek, gleaming under the sun like something from another world. They slowed as they reached the narrow lane, then stopped right outside his gate. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a crisp suit, holding a folder in one hand and something else in the other, a small, wrapped gift. He stood up slowly, brushing dust from his new shirt. The man walked toward him, not with the stride of someone used to being obeyed, but with quiet steps, almost hesitant. When they were just a few feet apart, the man stopped, looked him in the eyes, and said simply, "Thank you." For a moment, the world went still. Then, behind him, his daughter stepped out of the house, eyes shining, and everything changed. The black cars sat in the lane like something out of a dream. Long, polished, reflecting the afternoon sun in sharp glints that made the chickens scatter. Neighbors peered from behind half-open doors. Children stopped their games mid-chase, and even the stray dog that usually slept by the well sat up, ears perked. No one in this part of the village had ever seen cars like these. They belonged to a world of tall buildings, air-conditioned offices, and people who never touched a brick in their lives. Yet here they were, parked outside a house with cracked walls and a roof that leaked when it rained. He stood at the edge of his small courtyard, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. He'd changed into the new white shirt that morning, but now it felt too tight, too stiff. His hands, still rough from years of labor, fidgeted at his sides. He wanted to wipe them on his trousers, but he didn't dare. Not now. The man in the suit stepped forward slowly, not with the swagger of someone used to power, but with a quiet kind of respect. He wasn't flanked by bodyguards or assistants shouting orders. Just him, a folder under one arm and a small wrapped box in the other. Behind him, a woman with a camera and a young man with a notebook lingered near the cars waiting. "Sir," the man said, stopping just a few feet away. His voice was calm, warm. "My name is Rajiv Kapoor. I've read your daughter's essay, and I had to meet you." He didn't know what to say. No one had ever called him sir before. Not like this, not with sincerity. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he managed a nod and a soft, "Welcome." His daughter stepped out then, eyes bright but steady. She stood beside him, not in front, not behind, right beside him, as if to say, "This is my father. This is who I wrote about." Mr. Kapoor smiled at her, then turned back to him. "You've raised an extraordinary young woman," he said. "But more than that, you've shown her what real strength looks like. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that shows up, day after day, even when no one is watching." He felt his throat tighten. No one had ever put it into words like that. He'd just done what needed to be done, but hearing it spoken aloud, by a man who owned companies, who appeared on television, who could have ignored a letter from a village girl, made something shift inside him. It wasn't pride exactly. It was recognition, like someone had finally seen him, not as a faceless laborer, but as a man with a story worth telling. Mr. Kapoor didn't rush. He asked if he could sit. They brought out the only two decent chairs they had, wooden, slightly wobbly, and placed them in the shade of the neem tree. His wife brought glasses of water, hands trembling slightly as she set them down. Mr. Kapoor thanked her by name, having learned it from the file. She blinked in surprise, then smiled. A small, shy thing, but real. For the next hour they talked. Not about money or buildings or business, but about life. Mr. Kapoor asked how long he'd been working at the site, what time he woke up, how he stayed strong through the heat. And when he spoke, the man listened, really listened, nodding, asking gentle follow-up questions, never interrupting. At one point, Mr. Kapoor turned to his daughter. "You wrote that your father never complains even when his body aches. Is that true?" She looked at her father, then back at Mr. Kapoor. "He doesn't," she said softly. "But I see it. In the way he rubs his knees at night. In how he walks slower on rainy days. He hides it so we won't worry." Mr. Kapoor was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to him again. "You've given your daughter more than an education," he said. "You've given her character. And that's something no university can teach." Then came the part no one expected. Mr. Kapoor leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about your work," he said. "At my construction sites, we have hundreds of men like you. Hard-working, honest, carrying the weight of their families on their backs. But too often they're treated like machines, not people. Safety gear is missing. Breaks are skipped. Wages delayed." He paused. "I'd like to change that. And I can't do it alone. I need someone who understands this life from the inside. Who knows what it feels like to carry bricks under the sun. Who knows the difference between being managed and being respected." He looked directly into his eyes. "I'd like to offer you a position. Not as a laborer, but as an advisor. You'd help design better working conditions, fairer pay, proper rest areas. You'd have a voice where it matters." Silence fell over the courtyard. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He couldn't speak. His mind raced. An advisor? Him? A man who'd never sat in an office, never used a computer, never worn shoes that didn't have holes? It felt impossible, like being asked to fly. But then he looked at his daughter, saw the hope in her eyes, not just for herself but for him. And he thought of the men at the site, the young ones with coughs from dust, the older ones with backs bent like question marks, the ones who went home hungry because the week's pay wasn't enough. Maybe this wasn't just about him. Mr. Kapoor didn't pressure him. "Take your time," he said gently. "Think about it. Talk to your family. There's no rush." Before leaving, he handed the small wrapped box to his daughter. "For your first day at university," he said. Inside was a simple leather satchel, durable, elegant, with her initials stitched in quiet gold thread. She held it like it was made of light. Then, just before getting into the car, Mr. Kapoor turned back. "One more thing," he said. "Your essay didn't just win an award. It reminded me why I started this foundation in the first place. Thank you for that." As the black cars pulled away, kicking up a soft cloud of dust, the whole village seemed to exhale. Children ran to the road, pointing and whispering. Neighbors came out offering congratulations, eyes wide with wonder. But he didn't move. He stood there staring at the empty space where the cars had been, the weight of the offer settling on his shoulders. Not like a burden, but like a new kind of brick. One he could choose to carry. That night after dinner, they sat together under the stars. His wife held his hand. His son leaned against his leg, half asleep. His daughter looked at him, waiting. "What do you want to do, Papa?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've spent my life building other people's dreams. Maybe it's time to help build something better for people like me." She smiled. Not a big smile, just a quiet one, full of understanding. And in that moment, under the same sky that had watched him walk to work every morning for 20 years, he felt something new, not just hope but purpose. Not given to him but offered and now chosen. Life didn't change overnight. There was no sudden storm of wealth, no fancy car parked in the courtyard, no dramatic leap into a world of luxury. But something deeper shifted, something quieter, steadier, like the slow turning of seasons. He said yes to the offer, not because he wanted comfort, but because he saw a chance to make sure no father had to choose between feeding his children and buying medicine for his aching back. His first day at the new role wasn't in a suit or behind a desk. He went straight to the construction site, his old site, but this time he wasn't carrying bricks. He walked among the workers, listening. He sat with them during breaks, not as a boss, but as one of them. He asked about their gloves, their water, the hours they worked, the way the foreman spoke to them. Some were suspicious at first. "Are you spying for the company now?" one man asked, eyes narrowed. But when he showed them the new safety vests being ordered, the shaded rest area being built, the promise of on-time wages, trust began to grow. He didn't speak in big words or fancy plans. He spoke in truth. "I stood where you stand," he'd say. "I know what it feels like when your knees give out at the end of the day. I know what it means to skip a meal so your child can eat." And because he'd lived it, they believed him. At home, things changed too, but gently. His daughter left for university, her new satchel slung over her shoulder, her eyes wide with nervous excitement. She called every Sunday from a shared phone booth near her hostel, her voice crackling through the line but full of stories. About lectures, new friends, a professor who said she had a gift for explaining complex ideas simply. He didn't understand half of what she described, but he heard the joy in her voice, and that was enough. His wife started a small tailoring business from home, stitching school uniforms for village children. It wasn't much, but it gave her pride, and a little extra income that meant they could finally fix the roof before the monsoon came. His son, inspired by his sister, began studying harder, dreaming of becoming an engineer one day. "So I can design houses that don't leak," he'd say with a grin. The black cars still came sometimes, but not as often, and never with fanfare. Mr. Kapoor would visit every few months, not to inspect but to talk. They'd sit under the same neem tree, sipping tea from steel cups, discussing how to expand the worker welfare program to other sites. Sometimes they'd walk the village together, Mr. Kapoor asking questions about crops, festivals, the old well that had dried up. He never acted like a visitor from another world. He acted like someone trying to understand this one. People in the village stopped whispering about the poor brick man. Now, they spoke of him with respect, not because he'd become rich, but because he'd stayed true. He still wore simple clothes. He still walked to the bus stop. He still helped his wife carry water from the pump. But now, when young fathers came to him with worries about school fees or sick children, he listened and sometimes quietly helped. Not with grand gestures, but with small acts. A referral to a clinic, a word with a teacher, a loan repaid in kindness, not interest. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft golds and pinks, he sat on his porch as he always did, but this time he wasn't exhausted. His body still ached, some pains never fully leave, but his mind was calm. He watched his son practice math problems by the light of a new solar lamp they'd bought, with part of his first official paycheck. He heard his wife humming as she stitched a hem, her fingers quick and sure. And in his pocket, a folded letter from his daughter, her latest exam results, all top marks, with a note at the bottom. "I told my professor about you today," he said. "Your father sounds like the real architect." He smiled to himself. Architect. He'd never thought of himself that way. But maybe that's what he'd been all along. Not just moving bricks, but building something that lasted. Not just for his family, but for others too. Months turned into a year. The worker welfare program expanded. New rest sheds went up at sites across the region, with clean water, first aid kits, and shaded benches. Safety training became mandatory, not optional. Wages were paid on time every time, and whenever a new policy was introduced, his voice was part of the conversation. Not loud, not demanding, but steady, grounded in real experience. He never forgot where he came from. On his days off, he'd sometimes return to the old site, not to work, but to check in. He'd share a meal with the men, ask how their families were doing, listen to their worries. And sometimes when a young laborer looked especially tired or discouraged, he'd say quietly, "Keep going. Your children are watching, and one day they'll be proud." Not because you became rich, but because you never gave up. His daughter came home during holidays taller, more confident, but still the same girl who saved her pencil stubs and studied by kerosene light. She brought books home, read aloud to her brother, helped her mother with accounts, and every evening she'd sit beside him on the porch, just like when she was small, and tell him about her dreams. Not just for herself, but for the country, for people like them. One night, as fireflies blinked in the dark and the village slept under a blanket of stars, she asked him, "Do you ever wish things had been easier, Papa?" He thought for a long time. Then he said, "Easy wouldn't have taught us what matters. Hardship showed us how strong we really are." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a while they just sat in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't need words, because everything important has already been said. The black cars were no longer a symbol of distance or power. They were just vehicles that brought a friend, a man who'd been changed by a letter just as they had been changed by courage. And though their house was still small, its walls still thin, it now held something rare: peace. Not the peace of having everything, but the peace of knowing you've done right by the people you love. He still rose before dawn, but now when he stepped outside, he didn't walk toward a pile of bricks. He walked toward purpose. And as the first light touched the fields, he knew, without doubt, without fear, that the foundation he'd built with his hands and his heart would stand long after he was gone. Not in steel or concrete, but in the lives he'd lifted, the dignity he'd protected, and the quiet legacy of a father who carried more than bricks. He carried hope. It had been 3 years since the black cars first rolled into the narrow lane, and now, on a bright morning in late spring, the whole village seemed to hum with quiet excitement, not because of a festival or a wedding, but because today was the day she would graduate. Not just any graduation, but from the very university whose gates her father had once stood outside of, head bowed, wondering what it would be like to walk through them. He woke before sunrise, not out of habit from brick-carrying days, but because his heart wouldn't let him sleep. He carefully laid out the clothes he'd saved for this moment: a plain white shirt, neatly pressed, and dark trousers that still felt a little stiff from being worn so rarely. On the shelf above his sleeping mat sat a small framed photo. His daughter as a child holding a handmade science project, eyes full of dreams too big for their small house. He touched the glass gently, then turned to the mirror. He didn't see the laborer anymore. He saw a father who had walked through fire so his child could walk into light. At the bus stop, neighbors waved and offered blessings. "Today your whole village graduates with her," an old woman said, pressing a marigold into his hand. He nodded, throat too tight to speak. The journey to the city took 2 hours, but he barely noticed the bumps or the heat. His mind was already there, on the wide campus lawns, under the tall trees, in the hall where she would walk across the stage. When he arrived, he felt out of place again, just like all those years ago. Parents in crisp suits and silk saris milled about, chatting easily, snapping photos with sleek phones. He stood to the side, holding the marigold and a small cloth bundle containing a sweet his wife had made. Something humble, but full of love. Then he saw her. She came down the path in her graduation robe, cap slightly askew, eyes scanning the crowd. The moment she spotted him, her face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. She ran, not walked, but ran, through the polished crowd, past dignitaries and professors, straight to him. She threw her arms around him, robe flapping, cap nearly falling off. "Papa," she whispered into his shoulder, voice thick. "You came." "Of course I came," he said, holding her tight. "I wouldn't miss this for anything in the world." Later, during the ceremony, he sat in the back row, hands folded in his lap, heart pounding with every name called. When hers was announced, her full name, spoken clearly over the loudspeaker, the audience clapped politely. But he clapped like his life depended on it, tears streaming silently down his face. He didn't care who saw. Let them see. Let them know this girl, this brilliant, kind, determined young woman, came from a home with a leaking roof and a father who once carried bricks to buy her notebooks. After the ceremony, she took him to meet her professors. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, shook his hand firmly. "Your daughter told us about you," he said. "She said everything she is, she learned from watching you work." The professor paused. That's the highest praise a child can give a parent. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and said, "She made it possible for me to believe I was more than my hands." Back at the village that evening, they didn't throw a big party. No loud music, no expensive decorations. Just a simple meal under the neem tree, with neighbors bringing plates of food, children playing at the edges and laughter rising like smoke into the warm night air. His wife had cooked his favorite dish, lentils slow-simmered with cumin and a touch of ghee. His son wore his best shirt, proudly showing off the math medal he'd won at school. And his daughter, she wore her graduation stole like a crown, but sat on the ground like always, eating from a steel plate, telling stories about her final project, a low-cost water filtration system designed for villages like theirs. Later, as the moon rose and the crowd thinned, Mr. Kapoor arrived not in a black car this time, but on a rented scooter, wearing simple clothes and carrying a small envelope. He'd heard about the graduation and wanted to come quietly without fuss. "I have something for you," he said, handing the envelope not to the daughter but to him. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The photo showed a new community center being built on the edge of their district. It had a reading room, a small clinic, and a training space for young people to learn trades. At the bottom of the letter it read, "Named in honor of quiet strength. The Sharma Community Learning Hub, funded by the Horizon Foundation, advised by the man who taught us that dignity is built one honest day at a time." He looked up, stunned. "You didn't have to do this," Mr. Kapoor smiled. "You didn't have to carry those bricks for 20 years. But you did. This is just us carrying forward what you started." That night, long after everyone had gone home, he sat alone on the porch. The graduation stole lay folded beside him. The marigold had wilted, but he kept it in his pocket. He thought about all the mornings he'd walked to the site with empty pockets and a full heart. All the nights he'd added a single rupee to the tin box. All the times he'd swallowed his pride so his children wouldn't have to. And now his daughter stood on the edge of a new life, ready to teach, to build, to lift others the way he'd lifted her. His son spoke of college too, not as a dream but as a plan. His wife's tailoring had grown into a small cooperative employing 3 other women in the village. And he still rose early, still wore simple clothes, still preferred walking to riding. But now, when young men came to him for advice, he didn't just tell them to work hard. He told them to believe they mattered. The stars above were the same ones that had watched him trudge home, weary and worn, all those years ago. But the man beneath them was different. Not because his circumstances had changed completely, but because his worth had finally been seen, not just by his family, but by the world. He didn't need fame. He didn't need riches. What he needed, and what he now had, was the quiet certainty that his life had meant something, that his sweat had watered seeds he would never see fully grown, but that would shade others for generations. As a cool breeze swept through the courtyard, carrying the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden, he closed his eyes and smiled. The journey had been long, the road rough, but every step had been worth it, because in the end he hadn't just built buildings, he'd built a future. And it was already walking, talking, dreaming, and graduating in the world.